Welcome to the NC Spin After Spin. Additional comments from our panelists just available on our website. John Hood, what do you wish you had said on last week's show, but you didn't?
In the context of talking about the elections issues and the election bill, we discussed the idea of how best to apply voter ID standards to the absentee ballot process. And you had asked a question, do you think people will object to this because it creates an impediment? And I think obviously some will, but remember that part of the argument against the voter ID requirement for in-person voting is that it's unfair and potentially discriminatory to apply that when you show up to the polls to vote, but not when you put in an absentee ballot. So actually, I think doing it consistently across all types of voting, it's some kind of consistency across all voting types would be welcomed thoughtfully, I hope, I assume, by both sides. It's important to remember the voter ID laws have a cost, and the risk that they are targeting is very small. It's not zero, though. It's not zero, and it's not irrational for people to be willing to pay somewhat of a cost to forestall a low probability, but if it happens, very dismaying outcome, which is some sort of illegal vote would tip an outcome. We haven't seen a statewide election in North Carolina have small enough number of votes, probably, but we've seen a lot of district races and local races where a few dozen or even just a handful of votes would have turned the outcome. And the real way that voter ID laws probably deter some of that doesn't have to do with the stranger voter impersonation model that people have in mind. They sort of imagine maybe somebody's passed away and they vote in their name. A far more likely scenario, and there are examples that we can find, would be people voting in the name of a relative who's infirm, turning in an absentee ballot in the name of a relative who really didn't cast the vote. It was the relative.
How big a problem is that, really? I mean, we saw
it's not a big problem.
We saw an organized harvesting scheme and illegal activity in the 9th district.
But we actually don't know if any of those ballots that the actual ballots did not reflect the will of the voter. What we know is that there were a lot of improprieties about handling the ballots. We don't actually know that somebody voted on behalf of someone else different than they intended to vote or anything like that. I think the chances, again, the probabilities are low. If you look at the academic studies, voter ID laws do not much affect turnout. And as I've said on this show before, that is a problem for both sides. Mm-hmm. If you say it depresses the vote, but then there's not a lot of evidence for it, you've got a problem. But also, if you argue voter fraud is massive and voter ID will stop it, well, then you ought to see a decline in the number of votes cast. You don't really see much of a decline. So my argument is both sides are exaggerating the effects, positive and negative, of the rule. I think it is a reasonable rule, and most North Carolinians agree. I just think it needs to be applied consistently.
Interesting. Well, thank you for watching the After Spin. We'll have more video all during the week on ncspin.com.